Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for hosting me. So, as you've just heard, I'm working on a big project which I started actually 7 years ago when I first came to North Newton, spending some time in the archives to think about Mennonite belonging, migration, movement, and ideas of home and community. And it's very much the archival material that I want to talk to you about today. So I'm a historian, that's my kind of bread and butter, how we think about archives, and how can we use archives to think about belonging, and particularly belonging for communities or communities that are moving and are dispersed. I've worked on communities across the world, particularly with an emphasis on Mennonites who migrated from the Netherlands to the Vistula Delta in Poland, then to Ukraine, and then across here to North America and South America. So we can trace the movements, we can look at the records, but how do we think about belonging? In particular, how can we use the archives, the documents that we find, to think about that notion of community, home, and belonging? So I want to start with well, that's not the right one. So let's not put out the right document. That's fine. I wanted to start with the document which is a confession of faith from 1675. And this came from a community of East Prussian Mennonites, and it's now housed in the archives here in Kansas. So you could go and look at it, a 17th century confession of faith. And Ted Rempel donated this old manuscript. Oh, there we go, that is the right one, that's up. Ted Rempel donated this old manuscript, which he couldn't read to the archive, but he hoped that someone in the future would be able to translate it. So this is the document from 1675, and you can see it's in, obviously in German, in an old script, so he couldn't read this manuscript. This particular document has travelled a very long way. It had been taken from Brenkendorf in East Prussia and then to the Gnadenfeld community in the Russian Empire. The other papers in the kind of cache were all lost except this one, which was brought to Canada in 1925 by Ted's father, Nicholas Rempel, and then he donated it to a man called Cornelius Krahn, a noted historian and archivist. He inscribed this note on the front of it, but it seems it never made it to Krahn, as Nicholas's son Ted finally passed the document onto the archive here. So we've got this kind of history, this history of movement seen across in these three documents. The original one from 1675, the kind of wish for it to be donated to possibly an archive in Canada, and then a succession into this archive here in Kansas today. The actual practices and beliefs outlined in this confession of faith were, of course, crucial to a sense of Mennonite belonging. As the scholar Abraham Friesen wrote, for the uprooted Mennonites of Russia, inherited religious practices became so much of their Eigenart, their daily way of life, that they could hardly be separated from it. So this heritage of tradition and this continuity continues to shape belonging. But as important as the ideas in that document are, I'm really interested in it as an object, as the materiality of the object that had moved and migrated, and how it embodies this idea of dispersion and belonging. By the time Ted Rempel had the document in his possession, he didn't have a clear sense necessarily of exactly what was in it. I'm sure he knew what a confession of faith was, or particularly what it said, because he couldn't read the early modern German script. But he still knew it was important that it should be preserved and it should be put in the archive. So the document, not just for what it contained, not just for what it said, but also the fact that it had travelled with his family, with the community that had come a very long way, that made it important. It was a material reminder of worlds that were different, gone, and remembered. And so in its own way, it constitutes an idea about belonging and home. So I think this helps us to think about how belonging turns up in an archive, how it reflects dispersion and movement, and how archives can not just reflect, but even produce a sense of community and belonging. Now, we tend to think of archives as about something that stays put, a repository where things are held. It's about staying in one place, consolidating information that can be consulted, collected, a record, a history. But what happens when an archive is about recording distance, dispersion, when things themselves are moving? And how can the archive function across a diasporic community? And there are scholars who've worked on this, a scholar called Elizabeth Correns, who's looked at this kind of archival dispersion for Huguenots and Catholics who are moving across the world too. So I want to think about this in three particular ways. How would you take a document, how would you take an archival presence and use it to think about belonging and home? Well, of course you can read for what's in the document itself, but unless you are very lucky, it's unlikely you're going to get a kind of a full-on personal account, especially from the 16th, 17th, 18th century, of people saying, this is what belonging means to me, this is how I understand home, this is how I think about community, simply for the survival of records, but also the types of documents that people are writing. But we can use other documents which might not so obviously talk about a sense of kind of individual identity or emotions and think about them. So starting with church records. Again, this is also something which is in the archive here. This is the church record book of the Prešovka community, another community who are based in Polish Prussia in the Vistula Delta, migrated to Ukraine, the Alexandervol community, and the Alexandervol church is just up the road here, of course. And this is the church record book listing members of that community going back to the 16th century, 17th century, started in most of these records are from the 18th. And what you have here is a list, tabled list, numbered of the names, male and female, and they've got the number concurrently, so you've got, say, 42, and then a number 30, that tells you who their father and their mother are. So you can cross-reference belonging, you can see who was related to who. You also get the date and the place of baptism, the wives and partners, children, and then it records the death. The book's arranged by family, as you see, or at least it starts off that way. We've got all the Ratzlas here, then you have all the Beckers, and it cross-references all these individual records. So the records in themselves, of course, show us what the community thought of its belonging. They're recording members, they're recording who's in this. The opening pages of this church book talks about the origin of the names, the lineage, establishing identity and heritage. It talks about when the surname of these different communities, when Ratzlaff or Becker, the family history of that particular name. So for Becker, for example, we have a note stating that Johann Becker was the first person of that name in the community. We get information about his background and where he'd come from. These records are also very detailed and very specific. They obviously list the connections between family, and they also have incidental details which are written on. They have kind of little notes about what happened to people or relationships between people. And so writing everything in these books, which also have made their way across territories and seas, it puts kind of the personal memory into this communal memory of the congregation. And what I found particularly interesting, if we want to think about some of this sense of the way it goes beyond just a list of names and allows us to think about belonging, is some of that detail that we get, which is sometimes surprising. There's a specificity to the deaths that are recorded. They're recorded by the month, the day, and even the hour when they know it. And so then the age of death is calculated. So there's a lot of detail in thinking about how that would have been recorded, how people would have known exactly when people died, and that connection between members. And I found this one particularly moving. So these records here, okay. 125, 1295, 1296, Tod geboren, those of you who speak German, born dead, the year 1790, and you see all those zeros, there's no time. The child was born dead. So the idea of calculating the age, there's no years, there's no days, there's no hours. So this is incredibly kind of moving record of something which has happened in the community, this stillbirth of these children. And this is the children of Hinda Ratzlaff. They're unnamed, we don't know the gender, but it's kind of stark reality of the personal types of information we can get from these records. And this detail obviously has a very practical function. You're recording church membership, but it also has this role of recording memory, of recording emotions, and when these are transported, the books are taken with communities as they move, are preserving that memory and connecting communities across time and space. So using these records, thinking about the archival presence here beyond just what is listed as a kind of bare information. And we can think about this with other types of documents as well. So this is also a document, this is in the archive here. This is the house book, or kind of a commonplace book kept by Heinrich Donner. So this is from the 18th century, and it notes down for the community of Orloffenfelter, again, this is in the Vistula Delta in Poland, the yearly life of the community. So here he's noting things like there being a bit of frost, or he's talking about the weather, and he gives it year by year, or whether it's gentle frost, or whether the roads are passable. At other moments, he records important political events which shape the world that he's living in. In 1763, the book records the death of Augustus III, the King of Poland, which triggered a succession crisis, and in 1772, the impact of the First Partition of Poland. And these are laid out in a really interesting way. So this is the kind of bigger page of the record. So the distinctive significance of these kind of what we might say external events to the community, so these kind of big political events which are happening, which aren't being, they're not recording the ups and downs of community life, as opposed to those kind of seasonal events, farming and living, that's marked by the physical presence on the page. So if you've got a big political event like this, it's not fitting into like the neat columns. The columns are done season by season, so we've got summer, spring, autumn, winter. This big political event is kind of stretching across the page, breaks the flow of this document. And so it kind of gives some indication of how these bigger political events are disrupting that kind of seasonality, the more stable rhythm, perhaps, of life within the community. And this is kept for quite a long time. It started by Heinrich, as I said, and then continued by his son, Johann, and then kind of copied up and also kept. So we can kind of construct a history of the particular community, of the Donners in this Vistula Delta community. We can put that in conversation with other things that we have. We also have a history of the congregation, which gives an annual record of everything of note in the community, since Johann Donner becomes elder after his father. But we can, as well as telling that particular narrative for that particular community, using records like this, we can situate these communities in a bigger kind of context, bigger European context, connected to the Russian Empire, connected to things that are happening beyond that specific community. And I think this is really interesting because it gives us the sense of how external events are impinging or affecting life. We see kind of what are big narratives of modernity. If you were writing a history of 18th, 19th century Europe, kind of big geopolitical history, you would focus on things like the Polish partition, then the Napoleonic Wars, the rise of nationalism. But what we're seeing here is those kind of big narratives, but from the perspective of this particular community. So we get glimpses of them in a certain way. There are some things which they reflect on because they affect them. So they talk about Polish Prussia and the events there, but we don't actually get any mention of this being the era of the French Revolution or Napoleon. So certain things that reflect on this community's identity. And you also get the way in which they're recording and kind of taking ownership of things that happened to them. So here we get, this is a copy of a letter which detailed the privileges granted by the Polish monarchy to Mennonites, and this has been copied into the Chronicle. So kind of selecting events which mean something to them, written in, he's even written in where the seal on that original document would have been, copying that into their own record, integrating it into their own pasts. So thinking about the external world, the coexisting of the larger world of politics, and how that's shaping Mennonite belonging, and how we can see that in the way that the records exist. So again, yes, reading the archive for the actual information, but also thinking about how a record is constructed and how that shows us what a particular community might be thinking. So there's that, there's what you actually find in the document and what it looks like, how it's put together. And then you think about the material condition of something that survives. Books, paper, documents have a materiality. They survive in particular ways. So this is a book which is in Weierhof in the Mennonite archives in Germany. You can probably see it's a bit singed, it's a bit damaged. The edges of the paper here they're crumbling away, they've been burned. And this is a church record book again, and this is for the Danzig Mennonites. Again, baptisms, marriage, deaths, damaged at some point, probably at the end of the Second World War. Still readable, still kept. So again, you can read it for the information, you can get, where it's not damaged, you can look at the names, you can look at who was in that community, but you can also think about this as a material object. And the fact that it's got its own history. It's been kept and then it's become damaged, but it's still in this archive. And I always find it surprising, or certainly noteworthy, what people choose to keep and in what condition they choose to keep it. So again, this is, again, something which is here in the archives in Kansas. This is 19th century records. And you can see how badly damaged this is. The ends are all crumbling. It's very hard. You can make out a few dates. You can make out 1804, 1803. Higher up the page, you can read the record. But it's hard to see what to make of this. And yet, it's been kept. Because it still means something even in this condition. Because it still is the record of the community. It still survived, even though it's damaged. It's still come across the ocean. So that materiality of the actual condition of the thing is really, really important. And it, in itself, in its kind of physical condition, it marks the survival, perhaps the community, certainly, of the record. And you can also think about that in the way that if you were writing a diary, if you're writing a particular record of something, you might change and edit it. You might scribble things out, you might tear pages out, you might write over things. And so thinking about that is also really important. What can we see in the material record about how people have used the paper? So for example, if we went back and we looked at all those church books from the Prešovka church, you can see they've been scribbled on, they've been altered, they've added things in. There's one particular one where they forget to add in a number for a particular family name. And so they kind of have to alter the numbering system, and then they have to change the entry. So you can almost see the kind of thought process there of someone going, okay, well, I need to record all of this information, but I've kind of got the record wrong. So you can actually kind of see the hand of this being a process which is always evolving, it's dynamic. So the material thing of this record, it's someone actually writing these and working out how to record the information. You can see hands change. So you can see when someone else takes over the record. So again, that kind of continuity, someone writing in the same book, if you were to pass something on as a record and you handed it down to someone in your family, they kept the same book, and so in its kind of physical material of that hand changing, showing the generational mark of time, it becomes really important. It becomes a reminder of that continuity and the way in which that has been continued by the community. So we've got this sense of things being used across places, and I like this one as well, because you can also see how the record is kind of grappling with the migration of the community and then kind of having to alter the record. So this is from this Prešovka book, and it's got, you can see it's got names and it's got dates, so it's thinking about birth, it's recording community members. At the very top, it talks about Jakub Raclov, and it's saying that he's gone to Alexandervol from Prešovka. So what we have here is a record which is showing the split of the community. Some people had gone to New Russia, to Ukraine. Some had stayed in the Vistula Delta. And so this kind of record, which is supposed to be of one community in a particular place, is suddenly now having to contend with the fact that some of its members are elsewhere. And what do you do with that? How do you kind of change the material record? So that kind of, the materiality of this, that we can see how the record is being altered. And we can also think about how kind of books and paper function, kind of what they can do, how they can hold identities, how they can hold different notions of belonging and what is kept in them. So this Bible, again, this is one which is in the Rare Book collection here. It's a Strasbourg Bible printed for a Lutheran vernacular audience in the 17th century. It was bought by a Mennonite family in Russia in 1797, the Friesens, and they had moved from the Vistula Delta, from Polish Prussia, like so many others did. So the Bible, of course, is important. You can understand why someone would take a Bible when they moved. For the faith, for the family community memory, and then it also, though archived separately, had this little slip in it, which was taken from the front of the Bible. It would have been pasted in, and this is the kind of printed invite. You can see 1787 for the Mennonites in Danzig when they were being invited to move to Polish Prussia. So it's been kept as a memento of kind of the family, but you've also got this event in the community history, and the fact that it's a book, you can write in the book, and if you were to take a book and you were to think about how someone had stuck things in, or they'd written on the pages, maybe they'd torn pages out, we can think of the book as a material object. And then one final example of this, to kind of illuminate this kind of material history, again, something which is here in Kansas. Again, books and a separate sheet. So there's a folder in the archives which has a single page, which was also taken from a book, from a Bible commentary, owned by the Kraybiel family, and it's entitled Pro Memoria. That's what it says up at the top there, Pro Memoria, for memory. And it's a little potted history. It tells how Jakob Kraybiel bought the volume in 1791 in Krimmerhof. He passed it on to his sons, Johannes, and then Johannes to his brother Jakob. When the family emigrated to America in 1831, the book remained in Weierhof in Germany. It was too difficult to transport. It's a pretty big book. But it was so important to Jakob that in 1836 he wrote to ask friends to bring it with them when they too came across the Atlantic. His friend Christian Danner obliged. He transported the Bible commentary to Clarence, New York State, and Jakob records fondly that at the time of writing in 1837, the book had been in his family's possession for 46 years, and asks his dear descendants to preserve it. And this little memorial slip here, preserved in the book, gives this history. So again, the way in which you can write in a book and think about it as recording family histories. And then the final thing that I want to think about, and we've already obviously been kind of discussing here, is where things end up. So you can read for what is in the document, you can read for the condition, you can read for how it's being used, and then you can think about where it's found. So why are these things here? Of course there is, you have a college, there is an archive here, things have been donated, but how do things make their way into archives? Archives are something which are a product of kind of organising knowledge which starts in the 17th, 18th centuries and evolves into the modern era. So thinking about the history of archives, who decides what gets to be put in an archive? Who donates it? We all probably have family archives. We might have things which have been kept by our family. You may well have them at home, documents, photographs. At what point might you say, oh, actually, I'm going to donate that to a formal archival institution? There's something here which I feel that I can't look after anymore, which is too precious, or I don't know what it is. Think back to our first example of Rempel not knowing what the translation was of the document that he had in his possession. So that process of way an archive can think about the relationship between a family and an individual and a community. And if you go into any archive, and if you were to go to the archives here or to other Mennonite archives, you'll have things which have been donated as family fonds, as collections of documents, of objects, which don't necessarily have a relationship to each other in the type of document they are, but they've been collected by a family. So normally if you were going into an archive and you say, okay, I want to look at birth records, I want to look at the history of planning, I want to look at the history of photography. But in a family archive, you might have a set of documents which have been gathered together because they've been given by that family. And so you might find all sorts of things. I know there's in one of the archival folders here, it has a mix of things like a fracture document along with a passport still in its original leather bag. And then it has kind of diaries and notes. And these have all been put together in a family archive, so you can trace that family. You will also have the history of archives, why communities start collecting them. And you'll often see that archives start to be collected perhaps at particular moments of pressure, when a community feels that it is under threat and it feels like it needs to draw together materials that give it a sense of belonging. There's a very famous set of archives, the Peter Brown Archive, which is a rich collection of sources which you can access now on microfilm for Mennonites, which were assembled in the Molochna Mennonite settlement in Ukraine during the years of revolution and civil war from 1917 to 1920, so at a time when external threats were putting pressure on Mennonite communities. And these are really interesting. They were confiscated by the Soviets in 1929. I mean, it looked like they disappeared completely. They disappeared from public view in for 6 decades. But they turned up, and they turned up in the state archives of Odessa and Ukraine in 1990. And they've been microfilmed and they've been brought over to Canada, so you now can access those archives. And they've got a really turbulent history, which in their narrative talks about the pressures on Mennonite communities. And if you think what's happening now today, there's a new history of that. It might have been possible to go to Odessa, and certainly lots of scholars have spent time in Ukrainian archives. That now feels much more problematic. So trying to get to the Odessa archives, that's probably not something you can do right now with the war between Russia and Ukraine. So these kind of histories continue about how documents are subject themselves to disruption, to war, to movement. And documents do turn up in really surprising places. One of the most surprising places that I found archives on Mennonite history was the National Archives in Kew in London. Certainly not something I was expecting to find. I was in the archives there to look at something else and thought, okay, well, I'll have a look and see if there are any Mennonite sources here. Mennonites have never been a major presence in the UK. There is a community in my home county of Shropshire, but the London Mennonite Centre closed in 2010, so I thought, what are these documents doing here? But they end up in funny places. And these are documents held by the Foreign Office and the Dominions Office relating to Mennonites in Mexico and Europe in the 20th century. So one cache deals with British discussions about European Mennonites who were part of the complex negotiations over displaced persons and refugees after the Second World War. So that makes sense if you think about it. These were communities who were in Poland, in Germany, in Ukraine, places which were disrupted by the war, terrible devastation, people moving. So like many people, Mennonites, of course, were caught up in that displacement. And so you have various commissions going over to try and sort out what you do. Where do people go? How do you think about belonging in the post-Second World War world? Do you determine it on religion? Do you think about language? Do you think about where people have come from? And so all these questions about keeping your history and saying, well, this is where we came from, this is the language we speak, these all become conversations that communities, Mennonite communities, are having with various authorities in post-Second World War Europe. And so these end up in the archives in Kew as part of the Foreign Office. And then the other collection of documents discusses Mennonites in Mexico in the 1930s. And so there's a whole kind of set of things between Mennonites in Mexico, the British consulate, and Mexican and Canadian authorities. And then this is about Mennonites who had migrated down from Canada to Mexico, now wanting to go back to Canada. And because Canada had been part of the British Empire, it was still part of the Commonwealth Protectorate, to do that, those Mennonites need British passports. And so this is a strange kind of connection of this external world which makes us think about belonging here. So archives are really important, not just for what the document is, for the information that it gives you, but how it teaches us all these things about where things end up, how people use things, and how people inscribe belonging and a sense of identity in the things they choose to keep and the way they use them. There's a scholar called Eric Ketelaar who calls for the social history of the archives. So to really think about how power, belonging, identity are encoded in archival records and the way they're organized. And focus beyond thinking just about when an archive is created or when a document comes into it, but what's the social life of a document? What's the social life of an archival inscription, anything like that? Instead, we want to ask how are archives invented, how do they shape after generations, what role do archival documents play in cultures and memory, the writing of history and thinking about these questions of belonging and home. So there's many ways you can apply this, many ways you can think about it, and these are just some of the examples that I have from my own research, trying to use this to think about these contested notions of belonging and home across several centuries and across many places. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hill. We have some time for questions this morning. Could we get some microphones, please?
Students like me who are history majors and interested in going into history, who also want to go into archival work or museum work?
That's a very good question. I mean, you're lucky you are somewhere where you've got an archive, so getting into those, maybe because archives can feel kind of, I mean, they're huge. There's a ton of information in every single one. So maybe identifying something which you think is a kind of a nice niche and thinking about that. Again, thinking about some of these questions about not just will this document tell me something, but can I think about how it's got here or how it relates to other things. Loads of places obviously have really, really good digital collections now and things that have been digitized, and that's great, but there's also a lot you don't get from just looking at the digital stuff, so I would always encourage anyone who's working with this type of material to kind of go into the physical space if you can, and to think about those material questions. Sometimes things are too fragile and you can't look at them, but I think actually kind of, as a historian, there's always a particular, there's a different sense of encounter with a document when you see it in person, and I think if you can do that, it will spark all sorts of different questions. There are certainly things I never would have got unless I'd actually seen things in the kind of physical, with their physical presence. So I think that's a good idea. But I mean, archives generally also always want, if you can, not all of us have the chance, or the time, or the money, but want people to volunteer. There's always stuff coming into archives which needs cataloguing, and it needs looking at. So if you have the opportunity to do that, that's a great thing to do.
Also, how do you feel about technology being used to help preserve historical artifacts versus just keeping everything traditional?
That's a really good question. It certainly has an important place, and there are certain things which wouldn't survive if we didn't have digital records of them because they are too fragile. It can be really important digitizing materials in crisis zones. There's a really good project in the British Library called Endangered Archives, which goes to places in conflict zones and says, well, this physical archive is going to be destroyed and it needs to be digitized. So there's a really important role, and it's wonderful. I mean, it's changed the way that people can access things and preserve things. But the downside of that is what I just said about maybe being able to look at things, that there is something different about seeing something as a physical document. And there's also kind of maybe a conceptual thing. It's very easy to search and make a load of connections now. And because we can do that and go, okay, that comes across all these searches, you feel like those things necessarily are connected. A good example of this is if you're kind of doing a history of someone's life and you can find all the information about them and you can go, okay, well, that's how they understood their life. They went from this to this because it looks like they did. But it can kind of maybe give a false sense of how things are connected to each other sometimes because it feels so easy for us to put it all back together again. So there's caution both ways, but there's undoubtedly been incredible in preserving things which would otherwise have been lost to us, for sure.
So just an informal question for you,
Yeah.
but what's your opinion on haggis and square sausage?
Square sausage, genius, because how can you put sausage in a roll? Mind you, I spent a lot of time in Germany, and they see the bread bun as just it's a handkerchief rather than haggis. I'm not so much a fan of, but we'll leave it to the Scots on that one.
Absolutely.
Do you like open, closed, or half guard better?
Do I like what? Sorry,
Open, closed, or half guard?
I don't know what that is.
You said you were a black belt.
Oh, sorry. Did you say open or closed or?
Or half.
I don't like half guard. I like open guard. Spider guard was always my thing, and I'm a guard player. I don't do takedowns. Half guard I always think is like a pinning, stalling position, personally.
If you're here tomorrow, you should come sandbag.
Okay, I will.
While folks are thinking, could you say a bit about some of the other research that you do that might connect with some of the themes you've discussed this morning?
Yeah, sure. So my other book came out last year, which is ostensibly looks very different. I look at there are mountain huts in Scotland which are free and open to use. I mean, you have kind of hiking huts in the States, and that might seem a very long way away from the history of Mennonites, but there's an archival record there of books that people sign when they go to these places. And there's similar types of questions of how people kind of inscribe themselves into a place, how we can think about what is actually maybe quite a marginal community, a community which isn't part of the mainstream, and how you study that. And I've done quite a lot on the history of landscapes, how we can read landscapes. I didn't talk about it so much today, but you can think about the landscape as an archive as well. How place names inscribed somewhere, what are the physical remains of a community that you can see? How do people, when they see a particular place, understand it in a certain way? And I've done that with kind of Mennonite histories. A good example is here in Kansas, where coming over and to kind of farm the landscape and seeing it as something which felt similar or kind of at least recognizable from the wheat fields of Ukraine, but then how that also and that shapes a sense of belonging, and I've looked at that with kind of landscape histories in Scotland as well, how people kind of perceive particular places. So these themes that kind of run through my work, even if they look perhaps quite different on the surface. Hello.
What is the most unexpected thing or weird or funniest thing you found in archives that you just weren't expecting to be kept for this long?
Oh, that's a really good question. There is, in the archives in Ontario, there is communion bread, which is supposedly 120 years old, which has survived, and it's bread and it's there, and the archives have it and say, well, I think it was placed in the top of a house to ward against fire, a little bit kind of like a miraculous icon, but there's this jar of 120-year-old communion bread which isn't mouldy. That I found quite surprising.
what kinds of differences do you see between the archives that you visit? Like, in different countries, do they have different features or?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yes, they do, and it matters whether you're thinking about a state archive or a kind of smaller archive, different kind of levels of organisation. So, for example, if you go to like a big German state archive, it's incredibly well organised, and it's the catalogues are really easily searchable and everything's digitised. But it can feel quite impersonal. What I like about some of the smaller archives is because it's not digitised and like things might be in slightly random places, but then you find stuff and you get into conversation with the archivists. It's harder to do that in a massive state archive, and places can only. It's expensive to preserve things really, really well. So it depends on the kind of finances they have. But yeah, each country's got its own kind of archival history of how things got set up and who set them up, and it's a really. If you're interested in the kind of history of knowledge and of how people think about heritage, it's a really interesting question to think about.
And last question.
Hey,
All right, so it doesn't have like anything to do with artifacts,
that was
but
okay.
you're from Scotland, right?
Yeah.
So do you know how to play the bagpipe?
I don't, I'm afraid. I'm not Scottish. I live in Scotland, but I don't know how to play the bagpipes. Our neighbour does. Our neighbour plays the bagpipes. And I think if I were to learn, it would, deafen everyone. So bagpipes, unfortunately, is not my instrument.
Great. Let's thank Dr. Hill one more time.